I made mention of what I was about to start when speaking with Reg, but he did not show any interest, for he considered his association with that other group more important, and showed me all the paperwork he had collected from his previous involvement with the Rosicrucians. Having decided not to bother him with my interests any longer, I kept my friendship within certain limits as before. He preferred to continue with the group activities conducted by the hypnotherapist Jim Golding, who grouped people according to their star signs, and Reg belonged to the Leo group, although it was very unusual, considering that Jim was a therapist. It was not clear at the time what he was actually specialized in, whether he was a psychologist or simply a well-established hypnotherapist remained unknown. From what Reg said, Jim was keenly interested in helping those interested in mind control, and successfully demonstrated the benefits thereof by applying his know-how upon his adopted daughter, who apparently suffered from cerebral palsy. Reg was particularly interested in the practices of kahunas and their code of huna. He often spoke proudly about his involvement with Mr. Golding and the kahunas, and believed he could produce rain clouds by thought alone when practicing huna. I asked my other friend, Andreas, to come along to one of my groups, but his eccentric nature apparent, he explained he was going to go to Queensland, where his son lived, to travel into space within a UFO, and attend an urgent gathering by the Central Sun government he was a member of. His mental state and psychological condition did not cause any harm to anybody, and he was not receiving any treatment at the time, but was extremely friendly to everybody, and very helpful despite his mature age. However, occasionally I have noticed him coming to listen to me in the city when I lectured on subjects of clinical psychology, making a comment shortly after when meeting me for a hot drink, and telling me I was a master who came to Earth to help others. On the other hand, there were a large number of friendly people who accepted me as their friend in the group we newly formed in Caulfield. In regard to Reg, he did not take me too seriously at first. I believe he preferred to remain within the bounds of what was familiar to him, and probably his health condition was preventing him expressing his inner thoughts in other groups, unless he was conditioned to the not to go out from our organization syndrome. He loved preaching about his own philosophies to me without listening to what I might be saying. I suppose my very mild accent might have disturbed him. Obviously, he needed to talk to someone about his personal and private interests, and that person happened to be me, or his Baptist minister friend, who was more knowledgeable about his family background. His minister friend told him what his former wife Marianne said: "If I encounter him at all, I will scratch his eyes out." That greatly saddened Reg. There was something obviously more serious about him, but I did not want to pry. Personally, all the recent developments in my life had been extremely trying, and I needed to occupy my mind with more constructive, creative, inspirational endeavors, and even experimental interests, while remaining philosophical. Lee Iacocca sums up what I contemplated all along. In times of great stress or adversity, it's always best to keep busy, to plow your anger and your energy into something positive. My interests have always remained within a provable and repeatable premise. Furthermore, whatever I did or said had to assist somebody else along the pathway of life. I always believe that every one of us discovers little treasures and some wisdom throughout our lives, and if we are able to utilize them, they can become like a torch, shining brightly, providing us with hope. Remember the wise words of Jesus, which he must have adopted from a former source of knowing, for there is nothing new under the sun. You are the light of the world. Let your light shine. Do not put your light under a bushel. I contemplated that if what I discovered with my experiences and knowledge gained throughout the years is shared with others, like little treasures, it might help and inspire them, and I would feel immensely fulfilled and pleased. However, I could not do it any other way than voluntary and lovingly for others to see their own inner beauty, joys, and fulfilling aspirations. I could not primarily do it for financial gain, although creating a little wealth would never be a wasted effort. But it seemed everybody wanted to have everything for free. Frankly, what Malak and her husband desired to obtain in the form of a nominal amount of donations to offer me for the time spent with them would not even help me buy a loaf of bread. But nevertheless, I accepted their kindness. When they finally organized a get-together with their associates, some of whom were from professional backgrounds, I thought I was amongst friends, but as was often the case, I was apprehensive. This was not dependent on being negative about circumstances, but due to my previous experiences. Who knows what misunderstandings and judgments might develop, even amongst the gentlest people. Nevertheless, I needed to remain very optimistic with this experimental venture. After that initial meeting, talking about psychology, ancient history, and a few shared experiences, as well as trying the mental strings of the gathered, I was reasonably content and satisfied that we were not going to waste my and their valuable time. I outlined what program I followed, apart from explaining about my professional background, making sure that they all understood that no one was test subject and not obliged to attend every gathering if they couldn't make it. I suggested calling the group Unity of Humankind in Brotherhood, but not like a cult with a guru on a pedestal. I did not want to be considered as one of those individuals who preferred to make a great name for themselves. I chose to remain an individual, accepting and respecting one another, ever ready to learn from each other, for as members of human society, we can only improve our ways and become better on our evolutionary pathway if we can accept each other as our brothers, conversing amicably, laughing sincerely, and sharing our knowledge freely. Everyone was impressed with the idea as they realized that I had no hidden agendas, no surprises other than take me as I am, for I chose to remain a genuine individual without any desire for unnecessary attachments, fame, or financial gain. After all, if deemed necessary, all those things would be made available in one's existence as part of life's experiences. I was impressed with their willingness in sharing their own opinions on life's sciences. We also enjoyed a little light-heartedness and some humor, like Langston Hughes writes, "Like a welcome summer rain, humor may suddenly cleanse and cool the earth, the air, and you." After about 20 to 30 minutes of a relaxation meditation, with very light music and inspirational words uttered by myself, we continued with discourses on specific subjects. I experimented with channeling as before to see how they reacted, and the group have benefited from question and answer sessions in regard to health, science, and social issues we generally face. Some considered the channeling activities as being between us and the universal energies. During that time, I engaged myself in self-hypnosis and was able to verbally transfer what was already available to me from within my own unconscious mind more accurately, namely from my own research and discoveries, or as telepathically transferred from another positive consciousness. It did not matter whether this consciousness was from an exterior source, from within the vast universe, or within the world we occupy, because there are many wonderful thinkers and philosophers living on our fabulous planet. Possibly we were tapping into the shared conscious energy we are surrounded with, and telepathy, which needed to be studied more systematically and scientifically, realizing it is also one of the most neglected and not fully understood phenomenon in the world. Despite all that, any channeling activity needs to be taken with a pinch of salt, for still much more needs to be studied and learned, using some of today's techniques under more controlled circumstances. Since it was helping people find some answers to their queries, it was acceptable to keep experimenting with it. And it had no harmful side effect on my person, for it was similar to meditating. As we discovered, some of the knowledge made available was extraordinarily outlandish, but logical. It was generally acceptable within known human existence, and was based upon the individual's own interests and concerns when conversing with them, which I had no prior knowledge of. Since I always believe that all of us share our unconscious thoughts and emotions all the time, it was worth studying this aspect of the human mind within the parameters of one universal unity. Although it may be accepted as a philosophical consideration, it is something I could never talk about or make any sense within my own family and the witnesses, even those belonging to strict religious and other cultist groupings. Without being prejudicial, those worshipping an ideal or an individual ignore the fact that truth always remains personal. My discourses remained logical, based upon thorough research, discovery, and repeatable experimentation. I was also aware that one day someone might join in and break what was wholesome, helpful, and beautiful. It often happens in the human world, as it did a little while later. It can be likened to sandcastles children sometimes build by the seashore, only for some other child to jump on and destroy. Malek was befriended with a well-spoken lady from another group she was attending. It was a group of friends meeting regularly to converse in German. What a lovely way to improve one's language skills. Her friend was employed as one of the German government's representatives at the German Consulate General, and was very impressed with my viewpoints on life and background of studies while I was in Tübingen and Stuttgart, as well as my involvement with the university in Munich. She wondered if I could be of some assistance to one of her colleagues who suffered mild depression due to his new appointment in Australia after many years of service in South Africa. She explained that their appointment as ambassadors or embassy appointees could only be for a given time, followed by another placement elsewhere in different countries. She also explained that if any staff member was involved with the citizen of any other nation, that person would lose some of the privileges they enjoyed, but the person in question would gain the opportunity to stay in the chosen country permanently. Following this, I met with them at their official address at 480 Punt Road, South Yarra. Although I explained that my knowledge of the German language might be somewhat lacking, they insisted that my spoken German was excellent, and there was no problem in assisting the consulate member with his psychological trauma and depression. Just someone who could understand and talk to him in general would help him to see an alternative way towards his adaptability for the changed circumstances. But in the meantime, I was going through hell, as my personal life was in turmoil. I contemplated that by putting my mind into dealing with different issues exterior to my own might help me to put aside my own concerns for a while. I was obviously going to remain an enigma for many people because I chose to speak little about my own circumstances other than my educational background and discoveries. Malek's friend introduced me to her colleague, and I began having long sessions with him, conversing about a variety of subjects, dealing mainly with his traumas. Malek's friend, on the other hand, loved showing and talking about her personal antique collections. One of them, which she was immensely proud of, was a large edition of the Holy Book of Islam. She did not follow any religion as far as one could detect, but was extremely happy with that handwritten and colorfully illustrated Quran. She valued it, for it was given to her as a gift during one of her international appointments. She strictly advised the gentleman in question to meet me regularly at his private address in South Yarra. I utilized some psychoanalysis and suggested simple but effective therapies to assist him. I also directed his attention to other psychologists, if he desired to consult them later. Once he discovered there were alternative ways to consider when feeling depressed, one could see how happy he became. However, he needed to put a little effort into a more favorable transient state, from his appointment in South Africa to the one in Australia. If you notice, I have purposely omitted certain names for privacy reasons. Malek's consulate friend told me at length about her deep interest in a well-spoken and professional Sri Lankan gentleman. She was in love with him, and he was keenly interested in her. When I met them, I was glad to see how happy they were together. He was an Australian citizen, and it meant that if they got married, her circumstances would also change accordingly. She was content with that. In regard to the other member of the German Consulate, I suggested he see different therapists who could speak his language. Although he spoke a little English, as learnt at high school, it was not sufficient for him to communicate with the locals when and if there was need. And I had been additionally helping him to comprehend Australian patterns of speech. After a few suggestions, I did not see any further need to meet him on regular basis, and discontinued my visits. After all, I had to deal with my personal issues as well. My ex-wife, having taken the children, had disappeared for a long time now, all in the name of a fanatical religious endeavor. Obviously, being very gullible, she fell into committing a terrible wrong by taking the children away to somewhere I had no idea about. I observed all my engagements and hopes analytically for a substantial future, but was still depressed into a dull coma, thinking, what is the use of all this? I felt like doing nothing for myself for a long while. For example, it was supremely better to share the joy of cooking with my family once, especially when they were very young. But now I was facing complete emptiness, no matter how hard I tried to avoid feeling that way. I was sure that the children's mother was trying to make them forget me, who the witnesses attempted to paint black, for being a disfellowshipped devil-worshipper, because anybody who did not recognize their truth had to be evil. This was unfortunately still intruding into my nightmares from time to time. Under these circumstances, my income from part-time jobs and exhibitions of paintings in Australia was on rocky ground, and I could not continue with empty dreams. What those witnesses and my ex-wife had done in opposition to my person had negatively impacted on my existence deeper than one could ever describe in a few simple words. Although Magda called me evil since that disfellowshipment and judged me as unfaithful, Did she ever consider who or what was really evil? But I chose to keep struggling to make life work for me. For Magda, I was never good at anything important except in bed. My daughter's childish and immature stories were more believable to her than the reality. However, going back to my involvement with lovely friends from the German Consulate, Malek's friend and Sri Lankan gentleman finally got married, and I was very happy for them. I wished them well and hoped they would never experience what I had after my supposed marriage. I was invited to a stunning wedding ceremony and was so excited about it. I even contemplated painting a lifelike portrait of the couple, offering it to them as a wedding gift. Alas, I was hospitalized once again, with an awful urinary infection needing immediate treatment during that time, and therefore could not attend the ceremony. Later Malek and Edgar told me how wonderful the ceremony was, and they all missed me. I sent my apologies for my inability to attend that special occasion, but somewhat bitterly disappointed with me, they never wanted to see me again. That was very hard to take, and they obviously thought I was apparently making excuses. My health condition was seen as a lie, and as I was later informed, perhaps I had felt jealous about Malek's friend marrying a man she chose instead of me. But I was happy for them for starting a marriage based upon love and had no reason to be jealous. I certainly did not know them well and was disappointed and hurt that I could not make them understand what had happened, for they did not want to know. I did not need this additional stress. I am still unsure why I had been reacted to in this way. It remains a puzzle. Could it be a German trend, perhaps? Was it a hidden psychological issue on their part? Malek and Edgar often spoke of bagpipes originating in Egypt. Edgar was heard saying, "Oh, Scotties must have learned it from the Egyptians." In some Middle Eastern countries, this instrument was well known. In the early days of meeting them, we used to talk about more light-hearted subjects. Malek was generously keen about offering the special meals she used to prepare, and perhaps knowing my interest in cooking encouraged her to do so. When Margaret, who was obsessively keen in meeting me whenever she desired, without even considering what I might be doing, decided to come to see me in Melbourne, she insisted that she had to be included in my group at Malek's. Margaret had previously been frequenting Sai Baba-related ashrams, and she was content and happy with them, for she felt at home there. Without any thought to my needs and desires, she simply had to see me, to talk all about her own sadness, disappointments with her mother, and personal problems in the most negative fashion imaginable, also inflicting her negativities on my group. She believed she could learn so many things from me, considering me as someone who could manipulate natural elements magically, like Sai Baba apparently could, for she adamantly believed I was from the same ilk as he. No matter what was explained, she never accepted any justification other than what she assumed to be right. Interestingly, it seemed Malek and Margaret had met previously. When she entered the room for the first time, her eyes lit up when Malek spoke at length about the teachings and wisdom of the great Guru Sai Baba, and how she had discovered all about his greatness at the airport while meeting other people. She claimed that she too had been able to see Sai by some inexplicable psychic force without him actually being present at the time, and that it was a great miracle. That was apparently because Sai had wished it to be. Margaret spoke about her experiences of seeing him and feeling Sai's presence at different times, and she had noticed such miracles also being performed by Suren. For instance, when she went to meet me at Sydney Airport once, she saw me float, and others had also apparently noticed this phenomenon. This meant that I had to be just the same as Sai Baba, even claiming that my eyes looked like his. I would never claim to have similarities or any resemblance to Sai. He probably looked more attractive with his curly hair and colorful robe. Margaret often spoke about my background and what she suspected of me being like that other great guru, how she had met me in Perth at my studio and her friends attending Merva's group, adoring my wisdom. She spoke about how well I was known there. However, she also spoke to them very discreetly, without my knowledge, about me being in desperate need of financial assistance, and apparently she had felt like helping me out. How generous and beautiful. She additionally told them that she was now penniless after the advice given to her to leave her profession as a teacher. Then, according to Malek and Edgar, she made a few ungainly accusations in regard to my person. She told them that she hoped I would pay her back all her expenses and the previous payments she once forwarded to me, or perhaps I was going to look after her by marrying. She then cried about why I had advised her to leave her well-paying employment. It looked like they were beginning to see the distorted motives behind Margaret's claims, for it was extraordinarily illogical for anybody to talk about a person adoringly and then complain about him as if he was a wrongdoer immediately afterwards. However, I have my doubts about them really understanding my point of view. To begin with, I never advised her to leave her job other than tell her to follow her own heart. When she faced the prospect of a medically forced redundancy, as mentioned before, I had no knowledge of any such great financial help, which I had allegedly received from her, and had no idea of anybody else benefiting from it. However, I received a gift of a very small amount of money one Christmas, which I utilized with my then assistant when I lived in Perth. I did not realize I had to return it back to her even though she insisted it was a gift. Although one could see how disturbed Margaret felt, they chose to remain very supportive of her. When Malek spoke to me about this issue, again very discreetly, I felt confused by Margaret's eager criticisms of me. I felt that just for the sake of peace, I should provide the sort of money Margaret complained about. I still would pay her the sums she demanded, in order to have nothing else to do with her. But she continued conversing with me in a most critical manner, still demanding when we were to get married, ignoring my needs, desires, and plans. She attended my meditation group and was extremely impressed, yet her criticisms of me to others did not paint a nice picture. One naturally asks, how is it possible for a woman to complain bitterly about someone she considers a cheat as well as an ascended master, yet wants to be married to them? It is beyond me. I still believe Malek and her associates were unable to see what Margaret was experiencing. We certainly had nothing in common, and she was aware of it. However, in her fantasies, I was apparently the boyfriend and was in love with her. She often declared to others that she loved who I was, but in reality we hardly knew each other. Occasionally we met in Sydney over coffee and for a meal, but even when I stayed at her place in a spare room, I remained extremely private. Although she had spoken to me of her dreaming or was having sexual interests, it remained only in her fantasies. I know that when two people from opposite genders meet or spend some time together, others seem to consider them having intimate relationships in today's society, and men are hardly believed even when they declare the truth. about having had no intimacy. I found it very sad, and in fact devastating, not being believed. After a considerable time, Margaret appeared to interpret my decline as part of my spiritual growth, and seemed as if she reluctantly accepted it, although she had high hopes that I could be persuaded into her way of thinking. This is the utmost truth, for I have no reason to tell anything to the contrary, yet I was questioned by my new friends regarding this invented problem. They now knew, and were hopefully convinced, that I preferred to live alone for my own personal reasons. Who knows, they might have erroneously interpreted my desires as part of my gender preference. It still amazes me how somebody like Margaret can so loosely make negative comments about her assumed boyfriend, expecting that person to love and marry her one day. Malak and Edgar seemed to understand my position, but I was not fully convinced about that. Remember, in our seemingly advanced cultures, women are considered as always being more reliable and truthful. My ex-wife made use of this and told many untruths about me. As a Jehovah's Witness, she was believed to only speak the truth. In time, I was going to discover what my new friends really thought, but that would only assist me to know who my true friends were. As time went by and they met Margaret more often, she told them that she had known me a lot longer than they did, and managed to use her own twisted psychology to influence them that I was not an angel, perhaps even a pretender. After some lengthy talks with them, and logical consideration in regard to how I met Margaret and how our so-called friendship had developed, Edgar in particular began to see the pointers why so many ugly things had been said about me. Margaret needed moral support, but her continued desire to be married to me was not welcome. She proved herself to be very vindictive, and even angry with me for being too slow in making the expected approach, asking her hand in marriage. It was simply not happening. Her complaints about my person, receiving all the money she supposedly provided me with, was not helping the situation. She was like dog with a bone in her forever complaints about me. Although I have thanked her for her generosity for all those monies she claimed to have sent, in truth they never materialized. As indicated earlier, Merva's brother had offered me $1,000 towards the expenses of my studio when I opened it in Perth, which I preferred to return as agreed when ready. This was also one of her complaints, as if it was any of her business. However, I am a person who believes in honesty and integrity. Even if gifts given to me many moons ago were later claimed as needing to be returned back, I would simply return them with many thanks for the privilege. All the things Margaret complained about me could sadly be attributed to what a naive person she was, especially after all her efforts of the most negative kind, while at the same time expecting and hoping to be loved as in a girlfriend-boyfriend relationship. It was clearly evident where one stood. On a lighter note, let me tell you about something different. While I was living in St Kilda, I remember the day when it poured so heavily that the whole of Berkeley and Auckland streets were badly flooded, and the rushing water was above knee-height, so that the wheels of trams, buses, and cars were invisible to the observer. I watched the heavy rain for a while from my window, for we had been advised not to venture out until the water subsided. It was sad to see how those vehicles and shops were adversely affected. Everything was in a mess. All the precautions people were taking, such as sandbagging, proved futile. My windows broke in the heavy storm, and rain started to pour in, but I was able to repair them quickly. Interestingly, I had left my audio recorder running, which recorded the sounds, later surprising me. Normally, I would not ignore such things, but the sudden downpour had changed everything after I started recording some of my poems. In the meantime, Christina called me to ask about my ideas in regard to her personal issues. Immediately after, Margaret calling from Sydney, crying and talking about how insecure she felt after leaving her job on my advice, was not appropriate, although it was amusing. She promptly asked if I was going to visit her soon, and were we going to get married. My reluctance, due to circumstances after the storm, that I would not be on the telephone for long, was not taken well by either of them. Margaret was going to call me that night, whereas Christina, believing I was a great wizard, asked my advice how best to deal with her special interest regarding David Hill, who was head of the ABC network in Australia at the time. Whether I had to deal with the urgent problem I was currently faced with, or doing something for my own self, day or night, it did not matter. I had to find answers and solutions to certain people's needs. Christina was happily employed by the ABC, was a coffee connoisseur, an antique collector, and in a sense a very philosophical woman. She hated her mother for personal reasons, but was extremely logical. She attended some of the VSU gatherings with me and was not impressed with their artificiality. Occasionally, I met her in cafes, specializing in good coffee, but she was a very heavy smoker, which was quite a concern. I believe her only problem, and possible criticism, in regard to me in her mind was my slight accent, as she believed I was still thinking in my native tongue, needing to interpret everything into English, therefore feeling the need to ask me the same personal questions over and over again, allegedly to understand me correctly. It disturbed me a lot, but I elected to say nothing after trying to correct her assumptions about my lack of understanding the spoken language. If she would just consider my professional engagements, during which I was delivering lectures on subjects I had studied for years, she could comprehend my command of English being good enough for my students to listen and learn from, let alone my conversations with her. I found it so unusual how people assume things by focusing on my slight accent and not what I clinically and specifically spell out to be clearly understood. She looked almost like Audrey Hepburn and was keenly interested in black art. She assumed I was a well-established warlock and a master. I explained what I truly believed in and what we consider as the universal energies naturally filling the entire cosmos. I spoke about the ancient philosophers and those whom the clergy had considered as witches and heretics in the past. She believed she was an ancient witch and was unafraid of using the art if necessary. She also believed she could learn much from me. When she visited me during my Elwood days in the mid-1980s, she was so astounded how well looked after my children were, although their mother did not live with us. One day, when visiting, at a time when I had been attempting to make a sound recording, but having forgotten all about it, my equipment still on, I started making a cup of long black coffee as she liked. She was looking at my photographs on top of the fireplace. One of the images depicted my son Claude and me. In that image, I did not have my shirt on when one of my daughters snapped the image, and it clearly showed my hairy chest. Christina shouted, "Oh my, yuck, too much hair!" And it too was recorded, which I discovered it much later. Why she reacted that way, I could not imagine. However, Whenever she called me, occupying my mind with her perceived concerns, I have given time to her listening and not worrying much about my own. I would be a lot happier if I had some time to meditate and ponder about my own issues without any interference. My dark hair and dark-colored clothing I preferred to dress myself in had attracted her attention in regard to my assumed interest in the dark side, but I was not interested to reveal my true identity or interests to anyone. Others have almost always assumed what or who I was and would not accept my explanation of things about my own person. That was it. I simply had to be what they assumed me to be, and not who or what I truly was. That was exactly the case with my own daughters as well as their mother. They never wanted to know who I was or what I was interested in, only assuming me being involved in wicked things, influenced by the edicts of a cult my wife adhered to. They had to be right at all times, whereas I had to be on the wrong side, for I was disfellowshipped due to my supposed rebellion against their God and their governing body. On the other hand, I believe many people did not care what I was doing, eating, drinking, or just relaxing. Theirs was of vital importance, therefore subjecting me to their questioning as if interrogating me for hours. I was all ears anyway, wasn't I? In fact, I had no time for myself and therefore developed a state of mind I could classify as mental fatigue, and my life started to go into a backward spiral. Nobody asked me how I felt, but everybody questioned me about their own concerns. I was in need to spend more and more time outside, walking the beach, drinking cups of coffee, and writing poetry in order to find some solace, to contemplate on my own issues that mattered to me, my livelihood, my own existence, and ultimately plan for my future. I kept drifting into an oblivion. I have written extremely eccentric poems at the time, painted works of melancholic and expressionistic art, while most of my time to relax was taken by talking and listening to a few people with their selfish endeavors. The more fear you develop, the more imprisoned you become. The more hope you have, the freer you become.